Welcome everybody to this webinar on the importance of integrity measurement brought to you by Enveri. I'm Jason Rogers. I'm the CEO of Enveri and will be moderating today's discussion. For a quick introduction to Enveri, we utilize integrity measurement to ensure the core of a system maintains its confidentiality and security throughout its runtime, in part based on technology that we license from the NSA. Today, we'll be discussing the evolution of trusted mechanisms, the adoption of integrity measurement techniques across a few use cases, and why it's ideal and critical for modern system security with our panelists that we have here. A little bit of housekeeping. So we will be taking your questions. You can submit them via the question interface in Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. The audio and video portion for the attendees is not available. So again, if you want to interact with us, please use that Q&A feature. With that, I am very excited to introduce our panelists today. We're very fortunate to have these folks with us. I'd like to start with you, Pete, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the group.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Lascoco. I'm relatively recently retired from the NSA, where I spent almost 40 years working in the research group. I've worked on a lot of different things, but primarily in the area of operating and system security. I was a technical lead for the Security Enhanced Linux project and worked on that for a long time. I've worked in the virtualization space, and as part of that work, I started working in integrity measurement and did a lot of the very early work in runtime integrity measurement.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate that, and thank you for your time today. Derek, I'll move it over to you.
Sure. My name is Derek Chamorro. I am the head of security at a company called Together AI. I previously was the head of infrastructure security at a small company called Cloudflare. About 25% of the internet runs through them. Yeah, I've spent time dabbling a little bit of everything, most recently kind of in boot integrity, which coincides a lot with what the discussion is going to go with as well. Got a heavy research background, a lot of IP in blockchain cryptography and different encryption technologies. So good to have the discussion.
Thanks, Derek. Great to have you. Wes, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Wesley Peck. I am the CTO here at Enveri. I have a research history at the University of Kansas in operating systems and trusted mechanisms, and specifically helping to design and verify a trusted platform module. Since then, I've done a lot of things, but have come to Enveri and working on the runtime integrity products here.
Thanks, Wes. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our fourth panelist, who is on their way. I just got an email from him, so I'll do his intro for him. So joining us here shortly is Stephen Smalley. Stephen is a senior researcher in the Laboratory for Advanced Cybersecurity Research organization of the National Security Agency. He provides subject matter expertise and technical leadership of research and platform trust architectures and mechanisms, as well as technically cybersecurity outreach with the industry and government partners. Previously, he led the development and successful technology transfer of security enhancements for Android, so SE for Android, and security enhanced Linux, SE Linux, to maintain Android and Linux respectively. And he continues to serve as one of the SE Linux kernel maintainers. So it's great to have Stephen with us. He, again, is having some link issues, but he should be here any moment now. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So the way this will work today with just a series of topics that I'll pose to the panel, get a chance for you all to hear their thoughts and experience on this. At the end, we'll dive into some techniques that threat actors may use, that integrity measurement may be specifically applied for, and then we'll take your questions. So to get started, Pete, I'd like to start with you, and Derek, West, please jump in as you feel the need. We at Enveri feel that runtime integrity measurement is essential to the security of any system, especially if you think about it in context of zero trust and zero trust architectures, and about removing assumptions about the systems and resources and assets. Sometimes we forget about those things in zero trust. But for those new to the concept, can you briefly explain, what integrity measurement is, what it entails, and why it might be essential for modern security?
Sure. Integrity measurement means a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's a pretty broad term. And in perhaps its broadest sense, it's a security mechanism that is looking to take a target system and somehow provide a characterization of that system through an attestation to some other party that will look at that characterization and assess it and to see if it meets whatever needs the system is being used for. So technically, is it the system, is it what you expect it to be? Has it been modified? In a more specific way, integrity measurement is actually part of that process. It is the creation of that characterization. And that characterization is really the idea of some measure of the health of the system. It might be a measurement of a hash of some part of the system. It might be looking at some dynamic state in the system to see what it is. But whatever that measurement is, it is a looking at the system, putting that together and preparing it for an attestation to be used for that future appraisal. And that really has two important dimensions. So one is, how often can you do that? Do you do that right at the beginning when the system is coming up and never do it again? Or is it something that you do over and over again whenever you need it? And so there's lots of different ways that you might put that together to make that measurement work. The other one is, what is really goes into that characterization? If you're thinking of characterization as the health of a system, depending on what it means to be healthy, there's a lot that could go into it. It's much like measuring human health. In some circumstances, it's good enough to measure temperature. In other circumstances, you might want a much more detailed workup and imaging and whatever else goes into a health. Same with measurement. You could do just simple hashes of static parts of the system, or you could reach much deeper into the system and get a better characterization of the health of the system, or has it been modified, by looking at the different parts of the systems where attackers might be looking to hide. That's about it. I'm sure more of it will come up as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Pete. It's a good introduction. Go ahead, Wes.
I think that was a great answer from Pete for sure. From my perspective, I think this is complementary to what Pete said. I really think about it as kind of a mechanism for establishing the trustworthiness of a system, and kind of how it gets into zero trust architectures is, for me, it's really a technique for is kind of a generalized or a systematic technique for removing assumptions that you might have, right? So we have all kinds of assumptions like my users are trustworthy, all the way up at the human level, all the way down to, Invery's core IP. I trust that my operating system is behaving correctly, right? And we can remove those assumptions by taking a measurement and verifying that, right? So to me, that general definition that Pete just gave really leads to a systematic approach to approaching, zero trust architectures.
Yeah, the way I always describe it too internally, because I have to sometimes break it down in front of executives in like lay terms, is I'm currently going through a remodel and I have an established baseline of what my house looked like prior to any of the renovations. And going back, if anything has been modified in a way that I don't like, I can actually go back to saying this is the original state it was in. So it's kind of establishing that baseline of what we have been able to define as what we trust, and looking at modifications. Were they trustworthy or were they not? So you always have something kind of to refer to. And obviously we'll break down more of like some of the consistency checks and the graphing and comparison analysis. But at the end of the day, it's having that established trusted baseline and always being able to defer what condition or what state you want the system to be in.
I'd like to add one more thing, because we've been talking here about trust. And so there's an awful lot that goes into trusted systems, and we could talk all day what that is. And that's really not what we're talking about here. You've made a decision to trust the system, regardless of its features, whether it meets that technical definition of a trusted system, or whether it's a everyday Windows platform that you're using. Instead, what you're saying is that I trust this system, I've deployed it to use what it is, and integrity measurement is going to be that mechanism which is going to allow you to say that I have continued confidence that that trust has not been degraded any by some event, most likely a malicious event from an attacker.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Integrity measurement is not necessarily about validating that your software is trustworthy by any means. It's more about validating that the software you have deployed is the software that is currently there and running, right?
For sure. And Stephen, welcome. I gave you a very poor introduction as I read your bio. Sorry about the link issues. That was our fault on our side. We just got started kind of talking about what is integrity measurement. And not to put you on the spot, any initial thoughts there, or we can move on to the another question.
So I don't know if Pete's already covered this ground, so feel free to stop me. But for us and in our research, the impetus for pursuing runtime integrity really flowed out of our earlier work to advance the security of operating systems, but recognizing that even if we had the requisite security features in operating systems, we needed some way to know that we had actually loaded and we're still running that operating system in an expected configuration. And so going back, I think nearly 2 decades is when Pete and the rest of the team really began this work. The Trusted Computing Group was looking into load time or boot time integrity constraints, and Pete recognized that we needed to go beyond just that, although that was an important foundation and encompassed this notion of runtime integrity as well.
Absolutely, that's a great point. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. All of the things that happens on boot and why you need to validate it, at runtime and that. But that makes a lot of sense. And thanks for joining as well. With that, let's move forward a little bit. Modern adversaries, are more frequently deploying sophisticated exploits, and more often than not, they're capable of evading traditional event-based detection mechanisms. So Stephen, I'll start this one with you. How concerned should our audience be about these advanced persistent threats? How often are they happening? How does integrity measurement maybe address them at the same time?
Sure, thanks. So certainly coming from our perspective, protecting national security systems, we've been concerned about this for a very long time. And certainly nation state adversaries are employing ever increasing sophistication in their compromise of systems. But we're also, of course, seeing in the literature and in the general ecosystem how cyber criminals and other actors are employing the same techniques and likewise increasingly making use of these approaches to subverting the integrity of systems. And fundamentally, if you don't have that confidence in the integrity of your base system, then you can't really have any confidence in anything that runs on it. So in order to establish trust in any kind of security service that might run on a platform, you really want to have strong guarantees of that. And that goes not only the operating system level, but of course, everything below it and potentially up through the application stack as well, which is where some of our research has also done some exploration.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I could add to that a little bit. Long gone are the days where adversaries are going to concentrate on just government installations or even just big corporations. The days of special purpose computing are dwindling, if not gone altogether, where the same computers that we're using at home are very often the same computers that are being used in there. And so exploits, whether developed by a nation state or some hacker organization looking to do whatever, they get the economy of develop once and cast a very wide net over lots of things and see what happens. And whereas it may have been sane not that many years ago for a small organization to say, no one's interested in me because what do I do? Well, you have the same kind of computer that everyone else does, and they're catching everything, and they may or may not be looking to just steal something new. They might be looking to cause damage or to cause ransomware or anything else. There's just no end to the way that you might get caught up in that.
Yeah, we hear a lot from other agencies too around everybody's a target. And unfortunately, we hear from those organizations. Recently a small healthcare organization in Western Kansas targeted by these things. So unfortunately, it is
The other point is, you know, a lot of people say, why should I care? No one's interested in what I do, but more and more commerce is being done in computers, whether it's at home or in an organization, any organization. And what integrity measurement gives you here in that kind of idea is that the potential to know that your system is okay before you engage in some privileged operation that an attacker might be watching or trying to interfere with. And so those kind of use cases are real. Everyone knows about them. They're always in the press. But to tie that back to integrity measurement, that's something that we can do to help in that space.
Absolutely. Derek, Wes, anything to add there?
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I think Pete and Steven did a great job of kind of covering, you know, there's lots of different threat actors out there. A lot of different people doing a lot of different things, right? Some people are just looking at so chaos. We've seen kind of an evolution over the last decade or so of you know, some of these adversaries are just operating more like corporations in the sense that they're really driven by profit-seeking behavior, right? So they will and do attack anybody that they think they can make a profit off of that attack. And I think to Pete's point earlier, they've already invested a lot of the effort in building the system to attack bigger customers, but that does not mean they won't leverage it against a smaller company or a smaller entity if they feel like they can make a profit off of that, right? And I think the other thing is, I think, at least from my perspective, this kind of advent of AI is really going to drive some future where it's a lot easier for some of these threat actors to develop some of these capabilities, right? So it's long been seen as you know a nation state level actor or somebody with a great deal of sophistication that's able to develop one of these advanced persistent threats. But given the advent of AI and how easily that can make developing new techniques and new software in any sort of organization or any sort of entity, I think we're going to see a lot more of those kinds of threats coming out and a lot more rapidly, and they're going to evolve a lot quicker than maybe some traditional techniques can deal with.
Yeah, adding to that, instead of it just being so targeted, now you're looking at your supply chain, the third parties that you associate with. And so, and with AI, it's just becoming that much cheaper for them to do it. And so variants, you know, how, you know, an APT can evolve to a lot of signature-based methods might not be able to detect that in day one. You know, so this is a day zero attack. You're really looking at how are you managing the state of a device and looking at how that could be affected. And so again, with AI, it's just getting a lot cheaper and it's getting a lot more prevalent.
Yeah, I really see a future, you know, 5 years from now, maybe even less, where each piece of malware is unique to the person being attacked, right? So no longer do you have this concept of this piece of malware spreading. It's really a unique piece of malware derived by AI for each individual target.
It's actually a nice segue into the next question, which talks about the relationship between integrity measurement and traditional, threat detection approaches. And I think it can get to what you were just saying, Wes, around what do we need to do to stay proactive in our defense. But I'll start, Derek, with you on this one. As our attack surfaces expand, as AI comes into play, and these threats continue to evolve, how has integrity measurement matured? But more importantly, how does it compare, relate, synergize, if I could use that word, with traditional event-based threat detection systems? So your EDRs, your XDRs out there.
Yeah, I think they both kind of complement each other well, in the sense they both kind of focus on two different things. Where we're looking at kernel integrity measurement is looking at the state of the kernel, whereas your typical EDR solutions are going to be looking at other types of events, potentially some of the behavioral based things, malware, other types of attacks that are actually happening in your applications themselves. So, a lot of times you have these tools specifically for compliance reasons. You need to be able to show that you're detecting things that happen within your application. But how that attack might further affect the integrity of your system and the integrity of your kernel, that's where a lot of these tools, your typical EDR tools, are going to still be waiting for some kind of signature known event, even if it has to classify it or has to take time classifying that. And that also comes at a cost. And so when you're thinking about performance, having something that's actively doing those kind of measurements, and we can get into kind of the differences between like kernel integrity measurement and IMA, because both of them kind of also focus on two different things as well. Again, one is actually looking at kind of the state of your machine versus something that might be happening more in real time, maybe some factors that are actually affecting an application itself. And so again, it's not, one doesn't necessarily replace the other, but I think both kind of work hand in hand in order to be able to have a comprehensive view as far as what your system state is doing, as well as what your applications themselves are doing.
Makes sense. Stephen, anything to add to that?
So I would just reemphasize the point that what the integrity measurement based approach brings to bear is the ability to no longer be tied to signatures or merely identifying known bad systems or code. And so it gets us out of constantly chasing the latest developments in terms of implants, exploits, and potentially things that have not yet been characterized by anyone. And so it has that potential of being a game changer, and really offenders to have a much stronger position.
I use the needle in a haystack analogy a lot. Whereas if I'm event-based, maybe definition-based, I'm tearing through that haystack, trying to think of what I think of a needle is. Whereas integrity measurement, you think about it as scales, that needle is going to change the weight of that haystack. And that's what we're picking up. And so it really, by focusing on validating proper behavior, expected behavior, you are able to identify those anomalies out there that are those indicators of attack that a traditional event-based system might not be able to do.
So I'd like to add that, there are lots of different security mechanisms, and a lot of people might say, wow, what do I need one more for? Whereas those different kinds of security mechanisms, whether it's an encryption technique or any kind of firewalling system or, whatever we're talking about, as something that is designed to protect a system, it all hinges on a fundamental assumption that the system that is implementing those mechanisms is indeed operating as expected, that it's loaded, that it's running, that the kernel is right. And so integrity measurement as a mechanism stands aside from those kinds of things, because it allows you to maintain confidence that those things are actually being invoked when they want. And that's a big piece of the security equation is, are the mechanisms you applied really being invoked? And if you've installed them properly and they're integrated into your system right, integrity measurement will give you confidence that that is indeed happening. Whereas an attacker who might disable those things in the face of whatever attack it's succeeded at, if, in the absence of integrity measurement, you'll never know, right? You'll think that you're protected. It can do that, but the mechanisms that you think you're relying on are not really doing anything. And so properly installed integrity measurement is a different kind of mechanism that is a real game changer.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. And I think one of the crux there for me, the way I think about it, is that EDR, XDR, any sort of event-based system, it's consuming data that's generated by the system that it's measuring, right? So if I want to look at file system events, for instance, in the EDR, and I just want to, in my EDR, tell you whenever a new file is created, right? That information is coming from the operating system. It's coming from a different piece of software that's invoking those functions that Pete was talking about. And likewise, if I want to monitor some piece of security information coming out of SE Linux, for instance, right? That information is coming from a piece of software called SE Linux. It's generated by that system. The integrity measurement stuff, though, isn't from the system. It's about the system, right? I'm not taking information from this software. I'm gathering information directly about that software.
Absolutely. Wes, you recently gave a talk to an Elastic user group around again, I'm going to use the word synergy again, between the event stream of data into Elastic and then the stream of appraisals that come in from integrity measurement. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how they can maybe help each other?
Yeah, for sure. I'll try to keep it pretty succinct. But last time I talked a little bit about, in my view, integrity measurement and EDR, XDR, event-based systems are these systems that look at the state of something versus the systems that consume events from that something, right? They're really two sides of the same coin. And what I mean by that is if you imagine a perfect system, and you start from a null or an empty state, right? If I can gather perfect events about that system, I can regenerate any state that that system goes through, right? And by perfect, I mean absolutely perfect. We can never generate or build a system that perfect, but in math land, you can think about a system that perfect, right? And likewise, if we can capture perfect state, we can do the opposite, right? If I can capture perfect state on every state change, I can generate a difference and I can emit events that happen between those states, right? And so I really think though of them as two sides of the same coin. And if you are a math person, you can think of it a lot like derivatives and integrals, right? They're opposites of one another in some sense. And I think that's why these event-based systems and these state-based systems like integrity measurement work well together. I really think of it for folks out there that are familiar with like inertial navigation systems and that sort of thing. There are systems that combine inertial navigations with GPS, and what they're doing is they're using the ground truth of GPS to establish that ground truth like I was just talking about and prevent drift that naturally happens in an event-based system like an inertial navigation system, right? But that inertial navigation system can react much, much more rapidly than the GPS system itself can, right? And so I think of in a security world inside computing system is very similar, right? I can establish ground truth with this integrity measurement approach. And I can say, I know I measured this piece of software, and I know that piece of software is running the way that it should be running, right? And so I can build on top of that then all of these event-based stuff. I know if my software is running correctly, I know that that's the ground truth. I can then consume events from that software and I can have some level of trust in those events as well.
For sure. Thanks, Wes. Next time my kids ask why they need to understand derivatives and integrals, I'll point them back to this.
Just bring them in the office.
There you go. All right. Moving ahead, and then Pete, maybe we'll start with you here. I want to talk about use cases. Very simply, what type of organizations, what type of solutions benefit from applying integrity measurement, in their cybersecurity efforts?
Sure. There's many, many, many use cases. It's just a question of a willingness to do the integration into them. We tend to think about it in terms of I'm going to call it a monitoring, but really a health management kind of way, where there's a attestation to a third party to say, is that system okay? But it doesn't take much imagination to think a lot harder about how you might integrate that into things like joining a network or maintaining access to a network or any kind of transaction-based system to say that I want to know that the other end of that transaction is okay, whether that is a provider looking at a client to see if it's somehow worthy of having information or secrets or whatever released, or whether it's on the other end to say whether or not the server is worthy of accepting things like financial data or whatever you would be releasing to that. Or maybe some combination of both, where there's a mutual attestation done where you're expecting measurements from both sides to be put in. You could tie that to any kind of service provider, even like a web service. If you are looking to have that kind of technology, you can basically say, hey, before I rely on any information that you give me, I am going to demand an attestation, which goes back to a measurement of that. So there's so many different ways. And there's even some ways that are related to kind of what we were talking about before, but monitoring is a big piece. Many people want to rely on monitoring to say that the network and everything on the network is happening and everything's okay. Integrity measurement data is really just another form of sensor on the system. And so it can be integrated into monitoring systems. So that kind of information plays into the health status that a monitoring system might want to have. And so the kinds of organizations that would have that are everything from big organizations. Think about the military. Look, tying this to weapon systems. I don't want to fire that weapon unless I know that the acquisition of the target and any kind of sensor data that I'm getting is okay, or that the planning system or the authorization system are okay. Whether that's like the military or at home, there's just no end to the kinds of ways that whatever mechanism you're using, integrity measurement offers the potential to make it better in the more reliable sense.
Thanks, Pete. Derek, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I see. I mean, I see a lot of practical applications, especially from a lightweight perspective. When we're thinking about things like fraud detection, I used to work at eBay in the relationship with PayPal. The chain of systems they had in order to be able to detect fraud versus checking the state of the machine. So before they actually booted up any of their billing databases or whatnot, they can ensure that the integrity of the machine has not been compromised. And so that's one way of actually implementing it into their fraud detection program. I think about different service providers. I worked for service providers in the past, and the different methods that we had to do in order to be able to measure the integrity of the system. This is kind of another component of it, because we were always focused on boot integrity, and then we would get into things like IMA, integrity measurement, where we actually had to store these files, and it was quite expensive to be able to do that, and doing measurements based off the TPMs, and from there having a centralized repository where we actually monitor that. It was a chain of events for us to be able to do that on different file components versus actually, if we just shifted left a little bit further, we have a much more lightweight, easier, testable method to be able to do that. So again, a lot of practical applications I can see is like, fraud for, different types of financial systems, healthcare, again, validating the state of, patient records on the database of the system we're actually hosted in. And then again, from a provider perspective, able to incorporate kind of the series of measurements on different states of the systems that we were building around the world.
Yeah, for sure. We hear a lot about data privacy. I think we help our customers a lot with data privacy, just from what you're saying. If I can ensure the core of the system and measure it, then I have confidence that my data maintains its integrity, and I can trust my other controls, and I have that data privacy, for sure. I've got another one, but I don't want to cheat. So, Steven, any thoughts there?
And kind of interesting, we've also been paying some attention to the confidential computing ecosystem as a enabling technology for advancing security. And of course, they have baked in the concept of attestations, but only for, again, load time. So the initial VM state, and potentially you have to do some work to actually pull that thread all the way through even there. But given the trend towards confidential virtual machines, which themselves are running some kind of a kernel, kernel integrity again becomes crucial to an overall security story for those environments.
Wesley, I have one more quick follow-up to that, but go ahead. Go ahead, Pete.
Many of those ideas depend on cryptography, and the implementations of those cryptographic mechanisms are largely software systems. And whether you're storing those keys in some hardware device, you're still relying on the software systems that get access to them and are executing that. And again, this idea of a attestation that the system is okay, has not been compromised, gives you some confidence in the cryptographic mechanisms that you've employed to enable those use cases that happen. So even things like blockchain and everything else that you're doing definitely rely on the fact that the system has not been compromised.
Yeah, and I would almost beg to say that even then it's not. It's a very closed ecosystem. I work very well with a lot of chip manufacturers where they try to implement this as well, and it's either going to be vendor specific, where you don't have insight into the measurement techniques they use in order to be able to validate the cryptographic systems for things like encrypted virtualization or whatnot, or it's not necessarily an open standard. And so how do you do that safely, or how do you actually get more visibility into that? It's always behind the scenes, always behind the doors, especially when it comes to things like AMD set vulnerabilities, which happen all the time because of some side channel technique that was able to glitch the key that was actually being issued out to the to the operating system. Those things actually happen. So until it's like an open standard, you're really not going to really it's really going to be vendor specific. But even then, you're still relying on the vendor to be attesting to their own entropy sources and cryptographic processes versus having visibility back. That's all enclosed within the SOC.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to bring up, a little bit of a shift of topic here, but one of the things that we haven't discussed yet is just integrity measurement signals can be very easy to consume, right? And in that sense, they're applicable almost anywhere because you don't have to be an expert to consume them. They tend to be very black and white, meaning you either have integrity in this thing or not, right? And all the extra information you get about that is just helping you understand why you no longer have integrity in this system. But consuming that top level signal of yes, my software has integrity, or no, my software doesn't have integrity, gives you a very simple and very clear and very high value signal that you need to take some action, right? And so you might need to enlist some other expert to figure out what action to take, but you have that signal that something's wrong, you need to do something now, which is not necessarily the case in some of their security software systems, right? People make entire careers around knowing how to interpret the signals of some EDR and XDR software, right?
For sure. And by the way, I see the questions coming in. It's awesome. And we'll try to get some in line here, and we'll do more at the end. So again, everybody, please use that Q&A function. And I want to bring up a couple other pieces of context around, where to use it and how to use it. We've seen some organizations try to shift the kernel around and call it good. So I'm using a DPU. It has a kernel, but I don't have to check it anymore. But that's the kernel that you're using, or I'm using a confidential container that has a kernel. We have to check it. So, be sure that as you're looking to constrain your environments and constrain your variables, that's good in some cases. But there's still a runtime component and still an integrity component that comes into that. And then another one that we work with a lot, multi-tenant artificial intelligence, HPC clusters, where you're validating the integrity of those systems running those jobs in between jobs, especially in their multi-tenant. So it again comes back down to data privacy in some cases as well. The data that I'm using for my training mechanism is only mine, shouldn't be corrupted by somebody else, shouldn't corrupt somebody else's stuff at the same time. But let me bring this first question in because I think it's relevant to the use case and kind of what you guys were just talking about. So what are your thoughts? And I apologize, it says anonymous, so maybe that's how it was submitted, but if not, I apologize, I don't have the person. What are your thoughts on applications of software builds and integrity measurements? For example, builds that refuse to proceed if build environment integrity can't be attested, or builds that have their provenance cryptographically bound to the build time integrity. Steven, do you want to start? I'm just putting people on the spot, so it's okay to pass.
Yes, so I'm actually aware of some work in this arena that's trying to connect trusted execution environments and the integrity of build artifacts. And so I think that is important, and it brings to bear an actual mechanism for providing some integrity guarantees that you don't get from just an SBOM today. And so I think that does have value in integrating some of those concepts together towards an overall integrity story.
Yeah, it's funny. We kind of, at Cloudflare, we kind of used to cheat this because we had to do outside measurements, and then from there assign an extended attribute that could be validated before something could be executed on a system. And so again, it's relying on outside mechanisms, but to actually be able to do that and within the system itself, I think would be really important, because again, not relying on outside systems or worrying about compromise, because now you have a hash list that actually sits on a system matching that extended attribute for it to be able to execute. But if that actually gets modified, and trying to do that at scale on 40,000 systems can be challenging.
I think the comment about the build system itself being able to have integrity is key. Like if my system's building my software doesn't have integrity, then who knows? The build we might think does, but it's because it's lost control of the environment.
So my take on this is that it is a perhaps valuable piece to the load time integrity idea, that you are getting extra information that what your system is. Not only did it boot right, but it's still not going to come close to replacing where the true value of the runtime integrity is, where you're reaching into the dynamic runtime state, which has nothing to do with the build. So it's just a potential augmentation of the whole integrity story, because I think I don't want to argue that you need runtime integrity in place of load time integrity. I think you need both.
Sure. And these questions coming in are great, so we're gonna weave around a little bit these topics. This one says, can we expand on the attestation on demand before proceeding with a system request? And let me maybe take a step back in that, you can approach integrity measurement in maybe several different tactical ways. Like one of the ways Inveri does it is a background every 15 minutes, but we also have on demand. So you can say when an activity, let's say on an HPC cluster, a job is finished, that might trigger a validation of integrity of all the nodes in that cluster before you start another job. And then, third could just be automated. So I mentioned that as maybe a person can say, I want to do all those things. But you can automate that through some input signal as well. But any thoughts on, when to measure, how fast to measure, measures triggered off thing? And I think this is also maybe getting into if I want to transact something, where does the trigger go to validate the integrity on either side?
I'll gladly start. I mean, this is a very broad topic, and has been a part of our research for years. And you'd like to have a solid response, but it's not that simple, and it's very, very much case dependent. But if you think about whatever you're doing, even without integrity measurement, there's a trust decision being made, whether that's on some sort of authentication or an access control decision. And those are places that are instrumented into systems to deliver some functionality. And so if you think about wanting to make an access control decision, and that access control mechanism basically saying, before I give you an answer that the access control is all right, I would like to trigger a integrity measurement of whatever pieces of the system or systems that are needed before I even engage into the idea. That, it's one thing to say that yes, the credentials match with the policy, but it's a bigger thing to say that the system is worthy of our trust, to say that the credentials that are being presented or the policy that we're constructing or are using to check are indeed the ones that we should be using. And so it's a question of instrumentation, whatever use case. And I talked in very general terms before. There's that trust decision, and you can use integrity measurement wherever those trust decisions are to augment it. And that's what we mean by when we say that integrity measurement makes that mechanism better.
Yeah, and I'll point out that there's two sides to any remote connection or any remote activity, right? There's the side that's making the connection and the side that's accepting the connection, and both of those sides might be interested in integrity measurements and integrity decisions, right? And possibly different integrity measurements and integrity decisions, but there's interest on both sides, I think.
Yeah, that really comes into the attestation, and there's possibilities for lots of different attestation protocols that deliver integrity measurement one way or the other. And so when you're looking to integrate these technologies into a particular use case, you need to think about what you need for attestation, what kind of data from what systems or what parts of systems, and have that work with the attestation protocol that you're selecting.
Very related to this next question, how do you envision runtime integrity measurements baked into remote attestation protocols? So for example, building on the topic of confidential computing, do you envision runtime integrity being challenged, say, over the transport, TLS handshakes? I'm smiling because a lot of things we've talked about. Or will it remain in the realm of application purpose-specific bespoke scenarios? I will hold my opinion until the end. I'll let you guys go first. How about you, Stephen?
So I would anticipate it being integrated into existing mechanisms for confidential computing attestations or within the frameworks defined by RATs and the like. And so key to that is going beyond viewing integrity measurements just as simple hashes to a more general means of conveying the integrity properties of complex software. So graph representations, for example, and doing so efficiently, of course. But I would anticipate it becoming a core part of that and not be constrained to just being application specific, or at least that would be my hope.
So
Yeah.
we've talked about integrity measurement without directly saying, but implying that the measurement is happening immediately when we ask for it in whatever use case we have. And depending on what we want to include in that measurement, it's not a free process, and it's way too slow to have that kind of response in TLS or whatever else, or in fact, many of them. So we need to think harder about what we need in those, how often we need them, and have some sort of caching mechanism in place so that when we know that it's there and we know that it's fresh enough for the use case that we have, then we have the ability to look at that cache result, use what Wes talked about as a signal, saying it's a simple signal at that point that it's still okay. And then you can incorporate that into a lot more, and then where you're not as reliant on the performance of the measurement itself, but just the access to the result that you've previously cached.
Yeah, I worked on some of this at a previous company regarding the extensibility of KMIP standard. So prior to actually getting a key request validating the actual state of a device, and that could have been, you know, an attested state of, you know, hooking in, you know, LChem into the process itself. But you know, instead of actually doing it at time before you're, you know, for any TLS operation, actually before you actually get the key itself. And so that's just a policy model that we were building in order to be able to validate that the entity that's actually making the key request was in a proper state. Now, after they get that key, doing additional measurements and looking for that, looking at key revocation process is something we also worked on as a policy model. But doing it, you know, at that very moment, again, it would be an expensive process while they already had the key. But looking at modifications to the system state or the system host could be a reason why that policy would be revoked, and then thus the key would be revoked.
Yeah, I think.
So
Go ahead. Go ahead, Pete.
I would say there's still a lot of research in the how best to use this mechanism for lots of different use cases. And again, the caching, I believe, is the right answer. We've experimented with that, and it does work, but it still leaves a lot of open questions about what do you include in the characterization, and how long ago is fresh enough.
Yeah, and I think that freshness, I think, has to be model and explicit, right? I don't think you ever want to have a caching system where it's completely transparent to the remote system how long or what's been cached, right?
There are a lot.
better.
Sorry, Wes.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there are lots of other research questions there that are, what was this measurement used for? Can I use a measurement that I generated from one request in another request? And you know, there's questions about what do you put in, and are you leaking information about your system to people that are not warranted? So there's a lot of open questions that need to be considered carefully as we include more and more use cases, especially when they are in that very broad use case, like opening up a connection.
And I would lift the question up high to a higher level and say, I think everybody on this call would like to see integrity measurement and attestation techniques inside these TLS-like standards, right? I think everybody has that desire. We really do want to know, not just do you have the right identity, which is what TLS is establishing right now, but are you running the right software, and is that software in a good state, right? Definitely want to know that, but I think as this conversation has kind of hinted at, it's very tricky to do.
It is much more tricky. To give you an idea, we had been, and Steve can say whether they still are, looking at these questions and seeing how trust is impacted by the different kinds of ways that we answer those questions. And those questions have consumed many more research hours than the development of the mechanisms themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, we got started down that train talking about use cases. There's a question here about a specific use case I wanted to bring up before we moved on. So Lyle, hi Lyle, thanks. He asked, what is the prospect that this form of integrity evolves into a form usable on cellular mobile applications that use trusted execution environments?
Already been done. Not widely adopted, but it does and it works.
So it should be done, has been done in prototypical form.
There's an aspect of, I think, Lyle's question, which maybe is a more tractable problem than the more general one we were talking about, in the sense that a lot of these carriers have a lot more control over who, what, and when on their network than maybe in the general sense on the internet, right? And so maybe in that sense, some of these techniques are more easily applied there than in the more general sense, right?
Yeah, for sure. One of these questions ties into the next panel question, so I'll get to that in a second. I think this one's interesting. What if you have a system that you cannot baseline? I think that's it could be a broad topic, maybe an hour webinar all by itself. What part of a system are you talking about? What can you, can't you baseline? But just reactions to that, thoughts to what if you have a system that you don't think you can baseline?
Certainly jeopardizes the success you're going to have with integrity measurement, because you have to know what the known good is to reap the benefit of measuring the difference between the known good and what you see. And where the weakness of integrity measurement is that as the runtime pieces, we have endeavored to look at lots of the different runtime states that affect decisions or data that affects decisions. And it'd be awesome if we could say that the 100% of those that we've identified, we can measure and understand what they need to be. But we can't always do that. And that is going to degrade the answer you get. There is the potential that something is hiding in there. For instance, stack-based attacks are a interesting place where straight up integrity measurement of the stack is not possible. It's too dynamic. It's not predictable what it's going to be at any given time. You need to look at other things to try to counter those attacks. So if the whole system were not baseline, I'm having trouble saying, is that really possible or not? There's going to be parts of it that are baselineable, but to the extent that there ever was something that was completely unbaselineable, I don't think this is your technology.
I would say I would be very surprised if there's a problem domain out there that can't be baselined in any way. Baseline's such a generic word, right? And so maybe it's a problem more of looking at what a baseline is with too strict a lens on. A lot of times you can, and we can, for lack of better terminology, what you put in your baseline or how you look at the system when you create your baseline and still get some value out of it. Maybe not perfect, but still valuable to have.
I mean, there is a real practical problem hiding in that question, because there are parts of the system that you can't see, proprietary modules that are inserted in your system, or proprietary devices and things, code that executes on devices that you don't have a view into, that do have access to things on your system. And so the unfortunate, I think, reality is that can't be included into your measurements. And from a security acquisition point of view, you have to think hard about whether or not your use case warrants deploying systems that have those preconditions.
I think it all drives back to what is your environment. Usually there's a kernel there. It can be baseline, custom, whatever it is. But there might be aspects of it. It's an interesting question for sure. Well, I want to move on, and we'll get to some of these other questions here at the end as well. So it's been brought up a couple of times, and there's a question specifically, I think, around this as well. A lot of organizations, put effort into their boot protections. Derek mentioned, I think, a lot of these examples. SE Linux, IMA, read-only file systems, kernel lockdown. Integrity measurement extends these protections to runtime, and how they're working in memory. But, Derek, we can start with you, or Wes. Derek, let's start with you. Any thoughts on the relationship between what is traditional boot time security and integrity measurement?
I think it's like the secure trade-off. Again, boot time integrity measurement, especially when it comes to hardware, it's usually isolated to the specific hardware modules that are available in the system. And there's not like this, it's not like the OAuth world and applications where like, hey, we have a token, here's what you're able to do, and it's shared around. Hardware subsystems are completely usually isolated and separate. So there's not this concept of like a secure trade-off or secure handoff. So usually they're fairly isolated, and you have to find ways of being able to stitch them together, be able to create like this, single key environment or multi-key environment that is trusted in order to be able to trust the components of the system. But from a measurement perspective, it's also very limited. It's limited to, vendors or silicon manufacturers as far as what kind of measurement systems they have. A lot of them are isolated. So being able to tap into or get a lot of data out of that is usually just some kind of, integer value, 1 or 0. Did it pass or did it not? The conditions of why it might have failed. And so getting more involved into that has been kind of a challenge. But this concept of being able to pass it on into the actual kernel itself and being able to actually view these kind of runtime modifications or any modifications at base gives us a sense of what we're trying to establish on the hardware end, is having that same level of visibility. So again, it's just extending what this concept of a secure handoff would be, or what we want to be able to achieve on the hardware side into the kernel side.
Wes, thoughts there?
I mean, I think that was a great answer. Is really about extending that secure handoff from hardware to your trusted OS, and having that extend into runtime, right? I think we don't live in any sort of perfect world, right? So you can have a perfect handoff system between your hardware and your software, and you can be running the exact kernel that you're supposed to be running, and that kernel can be developed by the world's best engineers, which I mean, the people that work on Windows kernel and Linux kernel are world-class engineers. There are still going to be significant and real bugs in that system that are going to cause your state to drift, or potentially cause your state to drift into an insecure area or an area where you don't want to be, essentially. And the integrity stuff, the runtime integrity stuff especially, kind of allows you to detect when and where that drift has happened and be able to take corrective action based on it, right?
A question related to this. So with various LSMs, eBPF policy systems at every layer, IPE, SE/Linux, SecComp, container snapshots, Kubernetes administrator controllers, various hardware-based TEEs, it can feel like runtime integrity is both within reach and too complex to make sense of. So how is we can genericize this down to integrity measurement. How do we think about, cutting through that noise? I'll put the question over here too, so you guys can see that in case it's a pretty long question. I'll start. I think that there's a lot of things, I'm gonna say complex things, but things that happen either at boot time or at runtime where you're trying to restrict access or control over things. And Wes, you can expand on this. A lot of what we focus on is around the kernel. Those things all interact with the kernel. So as we're validating kernel behavior and making sure that the kernel itself hasn't been changed in an nefarious way, we therefore gain more confidence in that these other implementations of those frameworks continue to have our trust or our confidence in that they're working. But Wes, you want to expand on that?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot to this question. So let me know if I don't hit something that you were particularly interested in. But I think, as Jason said, there's one aspect of what we do that is, by protecting the kernels, we're protecting these LSMs, we're protecting these eBPFs and these policy systems. All of the stuff that's kind of mentioned in here goes through the kernel in some way or another. And by protecting the kernel, we're protecting those systems. But to kind of cut to what I feel like is the crux of this question, there's so much going on, it can be very complicated. I think that's really where the mission of Invari comes from. And in my mind, we've set up an entity here and set up relationships with other entities that really help us along that path, right? And so what I mean by that is we're connected to the NSA through a CRADA agreement. And through that agreement, we really research cutting edge new things, right? Complicated things. that may be on the horizon and that sort of thing. We've also hired a swath of engineers who have operated security systems in practice and know that for any actual security product to be actually valuable, it has to be very simple and easy to use. I've seen many times in my past security systems that were so complicated, people just turned the complicated pieces off. Right? I don't want to deal with that. It's too complicated. I'm just going to turn it off, and I'll get what value I can out of this. And so I think that's why in Very's reports, we always strive to have a very clear signal, yes or no. You have integrity or not, and then you can react based on that signal. And for sure, we provide you a bunch of extra information if there's not integrity. This is what happened. This is where it happened. This is when it happened. That sort of thing. So that you can make intelligent decisions there. But I think we really want to continue down that path of how do we make this as simple as possible to consume. I really want to have, and this is tricky, no doubt. I really want to have a system where we can bring in information about all of these things, and we can give very clear signals, yes or no, you need to take action or not, right?
But
So I like to add to this. So the complexity is real, right? Especially when you're talking about runtime. There's enough complexity in the load time measurements and keeping track of what system has what configuration and what measurements are stirred into that load time measurement. And it's not really suitable to have every place that would rely on that appraisal piece to be an appraiser because there's too much brittleness in the system. You can't update your system without telling everyone about it. But architecturally, we can address these situations either within an administrative domain or even across administrative domains by having appraisal experts and by having attestation protocols. Think of like the ticket granting server and a Kerberos kind of idea where you can do appraisals and get a ticket that says I appraised okay and integrate that into lots of consumers of this information. And there's lots of ways that you can do that. And that's something that has been experimented. In fact, even in the RATS community, that is one of the use cases they talk about. It is what they call their passport model. And it's that idea that there are other entities out there that can do these appraisals, that can deal with that complexity or deal with other problems like disclosing information. I might be willing to disclose information about my appraiser that I won't about all my systems. And so that I know something that came from a trusted third-party appraiser that I get that ticket to, that I can now disclose things across administrative domains. So there's a lot that we can do architecturally to address that complexity and performance kind of issue.
Yeah, and I think like things like BPF, especially like I dabbled with BPF LSM at Cloudflare. That is more or less focusing on, you can limit operations on specific sockets or operations on tasks and processes without having to, configure or write a kernel module. So it makes it very flexible, but it's more or less for fine-grained access control. Now start stacking that and start adding many policies. And that comes at a greater expense of having to do that. Don't get me wrong, it still can be lightweight versus the actual measurement side, which you're looking at one specific state and doing a comparison. That one's a more lightweight approach. So again, I think both go hand in hand, especially when it comes to things like file restrictions or kind of more the fine-grained access permissions that you're looking at specifically on a system. But again, I think they do go hand in hand, but they focus kind of on two different things.
Oh, great answers. Sorry, I was just browsing the questions. They're all very well worded and very good, so we appreciate it. Keep them coming in. I think what we're going to do is we're going to jump to the last part of our panel and then focus the rest of the time here. We'll go to 2:30 Central on those questions. Really, in this last section, we want to talk about some techniques that attackers might use and what integrity measurement does to find them. If you are interested in seeing these live, we at Invary do these walkthroughs with folks. So we'll actually show you a rootkit based on a real world example. The one we'll talk about today is called Drover Rub, that was disclosed by the FBI and the NSA. Yeah, happy to walk people through that, show them how these things work, how they circumvent certain protections that they might have in place, and then why integrity measurement applies to them. But to talk about the few techniques, we'll start with privilege escalation, and how that works and why integrity measurement's an interesting defense against some of that. Pete West, do you want to take that?
Sure. In many ways, privilege escalation is what the attacker's after. So no matter what the vector is that they have and the attack surface is wide, they're trying to increase that privilege throughout the system. Eventually, they get to a point where they can get into the kernel or some piece of the system that can modify the kernel on the next boot. And what integrity measurement is going to give you there is not the path in. Don't really care the path in. It's going to say, did they get in? Are you okay? And this makes this technique effective against zero-day attacks. And again, building on what Steve said about signatures before, you don't need to know. You don't need to care. Maybe you do care, so next time they won't get in. But you've caught them. They're there, and you can take appropriate action.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's lots of different ways to escalate your privileges, right? From simple social techniques, right, where you're gonna just call somebody and ask them to give you their password, and they do, all the way through software bugs in kernels or other pieces of software, all the way to supply chain attacks, right, where somebody's specifically injected a subvert mechanism to escalate their privileges, and it doesn't really matter the mechanism by which they escalate their privilege. It's really, we can detect that they've used that escalated privilege to move your system into a state where it's been compromised, right? And that's probably an overly political way to say detect that something bad's gone wrong, but that's what really it's about. And then the flip side of that is for kernel integrity measurement in particular, once you have compromised the kernel, you can escalate privileges of anything you want to at that point, right? So I'm inside the kernel. I can give processes privilege. I can change subvertly in ways that you can't see file privileges and that sort of thing. I can give myself privileges to write to read-only file systems, right? Even though they've been marked read-only, it's the kernel that's enforcing that. And therefore I can go around that restriction if I have gotten to that level.
So again, instead of finding the way that it's happening, detecting that it has happened no matter where it came from a bootkit to anything else. I'm going to wrap maybe a couple of these together. And then Steve, maybe we could start with you, and then I always like to pick on Wes because I know we have this conversation a lot with folks we talk to, but a lot of hiding going on here, hiding files, hiding processes, hiding TCP and UDP ports, even hiding modules themselves. So techniques to hide why integrity measurement finds it. Something you want to talk about?
So essentially, by assessing the kernel state and the consistency of that state internally, we can identify a module that doesn't appear in the module list, for example. Its presence as part of the kernel's code will be still found, or a process, since it ultimately has to be scheduled to run. If it just isn't included in the list that's exposed to user space, it's still discoverable. And so by analyzing that state and verifying the expected integrity constraints among those different components, it's able to discern that, which would be hidden from user space itself.
Since Wes, anything to add there?
So, I mean, I think this goes back to a point Pete made earlier that with event-based systems, you're really consuming data from that system, right? And the software is being constructed in a way where it is specifically emitting different signals or different events at different places within its code paths, right? And so when I want to hide something from somebody else so that they can't detect me, it's really about interrupting that code path somewhere, right? And so that then gets to be software specific. But if we talk about kernels in particular, kernels sit at this kind of interesting boundary in computing systems, kind of a special boundary, right? They are this boundary between the application world and the hardware world, and they do a lot of security enforcement within them because of that. And also because of that, there's this strict boundary how you communicate with those kernels. So they have strict interfaces on how to get data in and out of them, right? And so as an attacker, I can go attack those interfaces and I can change them. All right. And so, for instance, if you're familiar with the Linux kernel going back at least a decade at this point, there's been stuff like file system notification interfaces, right? Where I can say, hey, kernel, tell me anytime a file is created, deleted, or accessed, right? Or written to. And that goes down and it changes some kernel data structures, right? And then as the kernel's running, as things are happening in the system, it's got code that emits the events that you asked for. So I can just go into that function if I've compromised the kernel and just not emit those events anymore, right? Or if I want to be even more subvertive, I can look at the event that the kernel's about to generate, determine whether it's about me or not. And if it's not about me, let it through. And if it is about me, just throw it away so nobody can see it, right? So it's really about attacking that code path that goes from your application down to the piece of code that's generating that event signal. And if I can interrupt that path anywhere along that chain, then I can do kind of whatever I want to do.
Derek, thoughts on any of that?
He is all correct. No, a lot of it is, again, the manipulation of something that is going to interrupt that process. Like, rootkits use a lot of, local kernel modules. So, if, we can, break up that chain and be able to detect there was a modification, kind of what I was going back and like managing the integrity of like different critical systems. You're not looking at something that is doing something, per se application wise, something like that is going to want to interrupt the actual process of actually investigating something like, again, something like DFS hooking where, it's, something, you're trying to hide the files from a directory listing. You're trying to interrupt that process itself. And all you can do is actually look at what actually modified that process itself. And so that's kind of like where a lot of that visibility will come in. And, if you can actually interrupt that and be able to measure on the known state, then you're actually breaking up that flow that will actually modify that specific process from actually doing that.
Yeah, I think that's the key.
I like that.
In mind that you got to verify that chain has not been interrupted, and that's really what integrity measurement's doing. Go ahead, Pete. Sorry, I cut you off.
I'd like to expand just to say it's even more insidious what an attacker may do, because you're talking about just hiding things, but there's all kinds of decisions that are being made in the kernel about certain data values. So think about SE Linux looking at the in-core policy or device operations or whatever it is. By changing pointers in those data structures, you can change the behavior of the kernel. Since we've done away with memory segmentations, we can jump over to those decision points by modifying the kernel. And so any time that you're able to do that, all bets are off from what the behavior of that kernel is, and it's not going to be behaving the way you expect it to be. But integrity measurement will catch that. Right?
For sure.
Some of the memory protections that exist make integrity measurement less important, but the kernel itself is still the one that is controlling that. And if you get access to that part of the kernel, you can undo those memory protections. So again, integrity measurement is a good backup.
And there's a great article that Dr. Peck wrote on our website that breaks down a lot of these techniques, how they work, how integrity measurement finds them. So Jamie or myself, we can put that in the chat. Again, it's under resources in our on our site. It's the main article there, if you guys are interested in that. So from here, I'll pivot real quick and we'll get through as many of these questions as we can. But we'll start with you, Derek. This question is interested in the panelist view on identity and runtime integrity. So Derek, you already mentioned fraud prevention. For human identities in particular, it sounds like runtime integrity can span too many systems that need their state and properties introspected, acknowledging that Stephen already introduced the need for a graph. So Ultimately, what is the relationship between people and runtime integrity? Your thoughts?
That's a good question. Human identity, I mean, obviously there's going to be a human factor when it comes to any type of these modifications, and being able to, like, for integrity measurement from I'm a standpoint where we're looking at Cloudflare, where we're looking at known modifications to trusted users. And trusted, again, it's an arbitrary term, it's something that we define that. And looking at modifications on specific files based off of building a workflow of what those trusted users were, then we could actually take measurements based off of critical file paths and whatnot. And so I think there is definitely a good relation between both of those, be able to say, hey, these are our known users in this trusted state, especially since centralizing or having directory services that are centralized across 50,000 machines is a bit challenging. But we were able to manage the state of those users and be able to do things like tracking on that. So there is a good relation to that, because if that gets modified, then definitely we can say that that's one of the factors that we would take into consideration, that a system itself could have been compromised. And so I think, again, I think they do go hand in hand, but that's just kind of one component.
I mean, fundamentally, they're two entirely different concepts, but much like I made a general statement before about integrity measurement making other mechanisms better, integrity measurement makes identity mechanisms better. They need to be integrated in the system. They're running in the system. They're linked into the kernel in some way, or in user space parts, the databases that are having them. Checking the integrity of those pieces will allow you to have confidence in the mechanisms that are establishing and maintaining identity.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think it's important to remember that human identities, there are no humans involved in any sort of software code path, right? What's really happening there is a device that the human has is involved in that path, right? And we need to verify that those devices and all of the devices in between the user and the actual code are all have integrity intact, right?
Sure. Steven, anything to add there?
Back when we were originally doing the work that led to SELNX, one of the other key mechanisms that we talked about, in addition to mandatory access controls, was a general concept of protected path. So really being able to, in a strong way, establish the path from the user all the way to whatever software component needed guarantees about the user's identity. And so these runtime integrity mechanisms give us a way to have confidence in the integrity of those software components that necessarily mediate that path.
Yeah, I mean, there was a third piece too that integrity measurement could aid, which is this idea of a secure attention key to give you a trusted path into the kernel or some function in the kernel. And knowing that when you invoke that path, that it is a real path and that the system that's tied to it is in a good state, and giving a way that the user can see that. That is another augmentation that gives you something along the path to getting to a true trusted system, not just a system with a bunch of security bolted onto it.
Excellent. Next question. Posted there. In signature, and perhaps by extension, bootload time integrity world, there's a reference value provider approach to sharing what integrity means. Maybe asking provocatively, what's the virus total for runtime integrity? It's interesting. Or is that always context specific? Again, I have thoughts. I will save mine. So what is the database of baselines in the world for things? Are you gonna make me
I'm
go
happy
first?
to answer. I just wanted to see if anybody else was going to chime in.
Well, I'll start, and then maybe that'll spur the others as well. I mean, from an Invary perspective, from a Linux kernel perspective, we baseline every Linux kernel that we can find, have that in our library, provide that to our partners and customers, and not a bad idea to also open that up in a certain way. There are lots of other, I think, central libraries of baselines that exist for different types of things. But there isn't a virus total that I know of for a group of things. And it's we as in Very provide that from an eBPF standpoint, from a kernel standpoint, sometimes from a hardware standpoint. But yeah, we provide that. I think it's something that we need to grow. There are standards works going on out there about how you structure a baseline, what might be in it. There's several different standards bodies. I don't think they're anywhere yet where lots of people are adopting them or using them. So yeah, should there be a central database? Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know like a lot of the frameworks that we kind of establish usually get established by like Intel. So like I know Intel has Intel has like their own IMA docs they kind of publish. Like Cloudflare, we were able to base some of those and then kind of like create like struct files based off of known kernel symbols and stuff like that for every single kernel that we were publishing. But again, that becomes kind of complex and it's also kind of like, based off of a specific company. But having kind of like a standards body, I think would be great.
So I got two different answers to this. One of it is that the complications grow with configuration variability. And some of that is answered at an appraisal point of view rather than a measurement point of view, because the measurement is going to be the same regardless. You measure what you see. You're told to include this, and it's the question that when you're looking at that measurement data and saying, what do I see, that you really have to worry about the complexity of the configurations. And so the way that we do appraisals for the runtime integrity is really one of constraints, and saying certain constraints must hold on the data that has been measured. And a lot of the configuration variability can be addressed through that constraint mechanism. So that's one answer. The other answer is that complexity is much harder to manage as you go beyond just the kernel, and saying that I'd like to extend this runtime measurement idea up into the user space components and ultimately into perhaps long-running applications that are there. And so that is a much more difficult piece, especially when every piece of software or every system might have different sets of software, and you don't know what is expected to be seen or what ones are really germane to that question of health that I brought up right at the beginning. Do I really need to measure all of user space to answer the question that I need for whatever I'm doing this integrity measurement for? And so I think there's still some research to get to that full answer for dealing with the complexity. I don't know that having a database of them anywhere is going to help. Maybe individual pieces or means by which you can baseline on deployment will go to it. And having help from software providers to do that will certainly help in the adoption of this technology and adopt it through the whole entire system rather than just a kernel. But at the kernel level, we are managing that with a per system configuration that we get however we get it.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we've got like 8,000 or more Linux baselines already established, and then double that once we finish our Windows work. But we also offer our customers a custom baseliner because they might have a custom kernel. And so I think that speaks to there might be a library of things that could be common, maybe most people could use, but there's specific scenarios where your baseline is going to be contextual to you. So I think they both exist. I would throw out there, and again, this is a longer conversation, constellations and relationships. So even as you get above the kernel and you start thinking about the dynamicism that is the app layer, there's interesting relationships between apps and kernels and how things should work there. So I think we can chip away and iterate through that problem set or find some commonalities that should always be true. And then at the end of the day, for a given system, there's always going to be a custom element to it as well.
I was going to point out, I think all the stuff that's been said has been great so far, that VirusTotal is a database of bad things, right? And so I know it's bad, and it's going to be bad on any system. The reverse of that is not true, though. If I see a good value on your system, that doesn't mean it's a good value on my system, right? Because my policies might be different than yours. So for our product, for our kernel integrity product, we can say, if you've pulled Ubuntu 24.04 and you are running this exact version of the kernel and you've not made any changes to that, that you should have these expectations. And that's why we can build a library of expectations, which is this reference value provider, right? But we do have to provide that custom baseline here, because if you're not meeting those exact criteria we just went down and you have a custom kernel, then the good value that we saw for Ubuntu 2404 kernel 6.8 is not a good value for you. And I can't just apply it to you, right?
But it also depends on the use case, where you have to understand your tolerance for false positives. I guess false negatives too. So basically, you can't be flagging this as a bad kernel and taking actions for things that you shouldn't have. And it's going to make an expensive process even more expensive.
Yeah.
I was just asking myself if my tolerance for false negatives is any different from false positives. I think it should be, and I think it is. So. Maybe time for one more quick one. So can you talk about how integrity measurement might help post-compromise right of boom activities? I think that's another great question. Stephen, you want to start?
So, if I understand the question correctly, which I'm not sure I do, but
I've had a compromise, and so I know now that it's been compromised. Maybe I think I fixed it. What role does integrity management play, either in the forensics process all the way to am I okay now?
So in the forensics process, it's not going to necessarily help you figure out how they originally compromised you, since it is focused on the results of such a compromise, or the techniques that they're using to maintain their control or their execution. But it may show you that endpoint, and then you may be able to trace, using your event logs or whatever, back to identify their entry point into the system. It also should help you scope your search, hopefully much more finely than you're normally able to do.
Very good.
I have
Seconds, Pete.
an additional take on this, which is really getting to one of the true value propositions for runtime integrity. Put yourself in the chair of somebody running an enterprise, and some virus is running rampant through your system, and you've caught it. Now, without knowing which systems I have, your choice is to shut them all down and to rebuild them all, and one at a time do this. But integrity measurement, if you are able to catch the virus or whatever the payload of that virus is, you can now tell which ones have been affected, and the impact organizationally is constrained in a way that is not so in the absence of that technology.
Yeah,
Very good.
there's an important piece of that where, I mean, personally, I feel like anytime you catch malware, the safest thing to do is to rip and replace, if you can do that. But that's not always a possibility, right? We have a lot of customers where for whatever reason they can't rip and replace, instead they have to repair. And integrity measurement does have a place in that world where you're doing a repair instead of a replace, in the sense that it can give you some level of confidence, probably not a perfect level of confidence, but some level of confidence that the repair you've done has been successful, right?
Yep, for sure. With that, I think we're out of time. If the questions we didn't get to, we'll follow up with the specific people. Thanks everybody for your time and your questions. Hopefully everybody found it valuable. I know I did. I want to thank Pete, Derek, Stephen, and Dr. Peck again. I shouldn't use the PhDs when I'm not using everybody's, but thank you all, and we hope you have a great day.